I'm delighted to welcome you to the 5th webinar in the National Association of Scholars Race in Higher Education webinar series. This one is Mismatch and the Decline of Academic Standards, which explores how affirmative action has led to a decline in academic standards at America's colleges and universities. And I'll just give some of the words which have been used both to advertise and to tee up the discussion for our participants. Racial preferences not only hurt college applicants who are rejected for no other reason than the color of their skin, they also hurt the students who are accepted due to the plus on their application, but are not adequately prepared for the level of academic rigor. As academic merit is increasingly devalued in college admissions, professors must decide between lowering their standards or failing the growing number of students who have been misled about their level of academic preparation. Now, our 3 panelists, each of whom will speak for about 12 to 14 minutes conversationally before the questions and answers begins, are, in alphabetical order, Dr. Peter Arcidiacono, who is, am I pronouncing that right, by the way?
Arcidiacono, but certainly close enough.
Okay. I have been known to make many mistakes on names. Please forgive. William Henry Glasson, professor of economics at Duke University, where his work focuses on affirmative action in higher education. Dr. Richard Sander holds the Jesse Ducominier Professorship in Law at UCLA, where he focuses on questions of social and economic inequality. Books include Mismatch, How Affirmative Action Hurts Students It's Intended to Help and Why Universities Won't Admit It. Mr. Robert Verbruggen is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, where he provides policy research, writes for City Journal, and contributes to special projects and initiatives in the president's office. Now, I've mentioned one book in there. There should be a whole bunch of books which will be put into the chat and Q&A buttons at the bottom. I encourage everyone to buy them in large quantities from Amazon, buy them now and buy them for your friends. Not that it's a hard sell or anything. The chat and Q&A buttons are also where you will participate in the Q&A. Put in your questions. I will be reading them, or they can be answered directly by the panelists, who can also just talk with each other during the Q&A. Put in as many as possible. I read them in whatever order makes for a fun conversation, which means if any questions aren't answered at the end of our time here, send them to me, randall@nas.org, RANDALL @nas.org. I will be delighted to forward your questions to the panelists so they can have the option to respond to you, which means never worry, your questions will get answered here or later. Also, don't worry if you have to leave the webinar. It's recorded and it's going to be going up onto the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel within 24 hours, available in perpetuity, for better or for worse. So, with that all said, Peter, may I ask if you would go first?
Great. Well, thanks for having me on here. I wanted to start by sort of setting the stage for, why we have affirmative action programs in the first place and the scope that's sort of necessary to achieve, racial representation. So I'm just going to share my screen here for a moment. And I want to begin by looking at what the test score distribution looks like across different racial and ethnicities. And so these are for the 2019 high school graduates, so sort of pre-COVID. And what you're seeing here is the share of each racial group getting different SAT scores. Now, when you think about those top institutions, the Harvards of the world, they have average SAT scores well above 1,400. But if you look at the racial composition there, you can see that something has happened before college that's really gone astray. And as it stands, 1% of Black high school graduates, who are taking the SAT are getting scores in that 1,400 to 1,600 range. And then you can see that, Similarly, not quite as low, but still quite low for Hispanics. And then you see what we have for whites, and then you can see the Asian Americans perform incredibly well. Now, what that means is if a place like Harvard wants to have a share of Black students that mirrors, say, graduating high school students, they're going to have to do a combination of two things. The first thing is they're going to want to put weight on things that are not academically related. That's one way of getting around these things. And so you can do things like have a personal rating, things of that nature. But the second thing is you're going to end up needing to have very large preferences. Now, what that does is it creates a student body that is very different, across races in terms of their pre-college preparation. If you didn't have racial preferences at all and admissions was based solely on academics, less than 1% of Harvard enrolled admits would be African American. Now that's really points. I'm not trying to diminish African Americans here. I feel like what we've done is we failed as a society prior to college, and so then we have these programs that are designed to make it seem like things are okay. We're going to make Harvard look really racially diverse, and at the same time, the academic backgrounds are wildly different. And this stuff matters in terms of grades in college and what majors you go into. Now, at that point, given you see these big differences in academic backgrounds, something's got to give. And there are two ways that can happen. The first way is to really where the mismatch bites. Like if you kept your standards the same, invariably, students who are coming in with worse academic backgrounds are going to perform worse. And they're going to finish at the bottom of the distribution. That's a feature, not a bug, of affirmative action. Now, that feature is increasingly goes into the second way that you can respond, though, which is to lower the standards in the classroom. If we look at the next slide, this is what's happening to average grades at Harvard. Okay. This came from a recent Harvard Crimson article. The data has multiple sources, but the point is that average grades have been going through the roof. Okay. Now, maybe that's because these students are just working way harder now than they were in the past. This pattern of grades going up is a feature not unique to Harvard. It's going on everywhere, right? And it's not because students are working harder. The research shows that it's the exact opposite. As grades are going up, average study hours are going down. Okay, so we've moved away from the academics. Now, there are different ways that this can occur. As an example, we see big differences in grading across fields of study. So, STEM classes and economics classes tend to have much lower grades than other fields. The upward pressure is still happening at those places, just not to the same degree. And that's partly reflecting different demand for classes. So part of what goes on here is students are coming in with low SAT scores, end up being pushed into majors that maybe they weren't interested initially, but that will get you to graduate in them. And I'm sure that Rick Sanders got a lot to say on this about the way in which mismatch works. Mismatch is going to work much more on something immediately works on grades, right? It has to be the case that you're going to get lower grades if you're coming in with worse academic backgrounds. Then it sort of also works through major choice, right? Because with majors having different standards, you're naturally going to get that feature of those who are coming in less prepared, moving into majors that are not quite requiring as many study hours. And majors that don't require you to build on your past academic background. So math classes, for example, build on one another. But our inability to face that very basic issue, that if you come in with less preparation, invariably something's going to be happening on that front when you get to college, is really costing us And you can see that Rick's going to spend a lot of time talking about law schools, but the best example of this is the firing of Professor Sellers at Georgetown Law School. And what happened with her is she was caught on video. They had a recorded video session that she didn't realize that they continued the recording. And she got caught lamenting the fact that her Black students were finishing at the bottom of the class routinely. Okay. This was a lament. It's a little cringy to watch, but it was still noticing what was happening there. What did Georgetown Law do? They lambasted Professor Sellers, basically saying that she was a racist, and that was the consensus view, and nobody really wanted to speak up, within Georgetown in that regard. But the reality is that this was happening not just in Sellers' class, but likely happening in all of these law classes. And Rick has shown this in his work. He's shown that your LSAT scores and your undergraduate grades matter for your law school performance. And affirmative action is much more aggressive there than it is at the undergraduate level. So this is not a surprise at all that you would have that happen. But there is this trade-off. And I think that, mismatch versus decline academic standards illustrates that perfectly. If you kept the academic standards the same, then those students are going to do really poorly. But there is a way to get rid of mismatch, right? The way to get rid of mismatch is to basically hand out grades that are the same without regard to how your performance. And that's the decline in academic standards. My own view is that this, at the undergraduate level, that mismatch may have been a much bigger issue, 10 years ago, but that the standards continue to collapse. So maybe it isn't quite at the same level as it once was. And woe to the professor who dares to have those standards, as we saw with the professor at NYU, who the class was organic chemistry, and the class, the professor didn't respond to the fact that with COVID, students were coming in much less prepared than they had in the past. And he failed a lot of them. And the university's response was to fire him. So there is this tension there. And it's almost who's going to blink? The admissions officers are going to change the standards. The faculty are often not involved with admissions practices, and the faculty are blinking. They say, okay, well, they're coming in with much worse backgrounds. I'm going to change what I do and no longer teach at the same level that I used to. So I think that's sort of where I'll wrap up with my introductory remarks. But fundamentally, this trade-off that you face between, if you're going to lower standards on the admissions side, you're either going to have mismatch when they're in college, or you're going to see a lowering of academic standards once they get there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm now going to ask Richard, would you be so kind as to go second? You're muted still.
Okay, thanks, David. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
And my slides are up? You can see the slides okay? Is that right? Anybody see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. So yeah, I'm essentially going to build on some of the things Peter said. I'm going to give you a few examples of recent mismatch research at the professional school level, so you can sort of get a sense of how the discussion of this issue is evolving. I started talking about mismatch almost 20 years ago with an article about affirmative action in American law schools. And at the time, the database that I had was a systematic data collection effort by the Law School Admissions Council to try to understand the racial gap in bar passage rates. In the early 1990s, when they did the study, Blacks were 4 times as likely to fail the bar on their first attempt and 6 times as likely to never pass the bar. So this was of great concern, and people got together, and 90% of the law schools in the country cooperated in furnishing data so that this could be systematically analyzed. LSAC made a critical decision when they released the data to not identify individual schools. So it wasn't possible with the data to figure out, to actually measure individual students' level of mismatch. You couldn't directly compare any given student to their classmates, but you could look at aggregate patterns and make inferences. And that's what my article did. So this first table shows the kind of admissions preferences that Peter was discussing. This is what was operating at the University of Michigan when they were sued in the Grutter lawsuit 25 years ago. And what this table is showing is that whites and blacks are admitted at similar rates if you just adjust the academic index of white students 140 points downwards. 140 points would be equivalent to about 1 point of GPA and 10 points on the LSAT score, roughly a standard deviation. When you make that adjustment, you get very similar admissions rates because what the school was essentially doing was adding 140 points to every black student's application. An important point to understand that's often missed in this discussion is that these sorts of credentials do not underpredict the performance of any particular racial group. Race essentially disappears once you control for students' credentials and their position in a class. So this second table shows the GPAs. This is from the LSAC study. This is showing GPAs at students who generally went to elite schools like the University of Michigan. About half of the black students are in the bottom decile of the GPA distribution. And as Peter said, this is just a kind of an inexorable working out of the preference. There's no black underperformance here. There's just a mismatch problem, a problem of students being admitted to schools where their credentials are much lower than their classmates. So not surprisingly, they're going to have grades that are generally lower than their classmates. Now, it's important to point out that this is a generalization. There are blacks who succeed despite being mismatched. There are whites and Asian Americans who are mismatched because they get some other type of preference, a legacy preference, an athletic preference in the undergraduate level. We at my law school, we've sometimes given a preference for students interested in public interest careers. So the racial effect is pronounced, and it's sort of the most troubling aspect of this. But there's nothing unique about mismatch interacting with race. It's going to happen with any school, any student body that receives large preferences. So what's interesting and significant is that over time we have gradually gotten better data. And I'm publishing an article in the Journal of Legal Education, a conservative, mainstream sort of flagship journal of the American Association of Law Schools, which after a long negotiation has agreed to publish an article that I did with Robert Steinbuch. And it's the first article at the law school level to directly measure individual levels of mismatch. And we're able to look at students at 9 different cohorts across 3 law schools in 2 states and measure their individual mismatch and see how that affects their performance. And this table sort of provides a nice picture of some of those findings, where you could see that at the elite law school, UCLA, overall bar passage rates, that's the bottom row, are higher than at the other schools. You would expect that because the students are academically stronger. And UCLA students who have credentials close to the 164 median for the class do really well at UCLA. But if their credentials are much lower, their performance drops off at a dramatic rate. So if they have LSAT scores of 150 to 152, then UCLA students have a 22% bar passage rate, compared to 51% at the somewhat less elite UC Davis and 79% at the non-elite University of Arkansas at Little Rock. So these are enormous magnitudes of difference, and they actually understate the difference in performance because UCLA is admitting students with low LSATs who have higher undergraduate grades than at Little Rock. So the effects are pretty staggering. This chart is showing for a large national sample, really a population of students attending public law schools, the degree of mismatch that different students experience. And again, what you can see is that there are white and Asian American students who are very mismatched. A very high level of mismatch would be 5, 6, or 7 here. But for Blacks, you're 40 times as likely to be in a law school with a very large degree of mismatch than a white is. Hispanics are 10 times as likely. So you're really stacking the odds against those groups. With this direct mismatch measurement, we can actually estimate the effect of a given level of mismatch upon your chances of passing the bar. So what you can see is that if you're not mismatched and you have the same credentials as a comparison group of students, you have an implied bar passage rate of about 86%. Whereas if you're highly mismatched, you have an implied bar passage rate of about 39%. So again, it's a dramatic thing. And with estimates like this, you can actually go back and figure out, come up with a reasonable back of the envelope estimate of how much of the racial bar passage gap can be explained just by mismatch. And the answer is that it explains about 4/5 of the Black-white bar passage gap, according to the most recent data, and about 2/3 of the Hispanic-white bar passage gap. So in other words, the performance differences that people used to feel really great concern about could be largely solved if we simply change the allocation of students across schools. These are addressable problems. Now, as Peter mentioned, there's still the underlying differences in credentials, and that needs to be addressed too. I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. But we can make the current situation much better by taking steps to address mismatch. So I got to say just a couple of things about medical school, because I've recently sort of branched out into this area. And medical school, like law school, has a difficult first-year curriculum. It also has exams that students need to pass to practice under most circumstances. So let me just show you a couple things about medical school admissions and outcomes. This first slide is a way of summarizing the preference differences. Black students come in, I'm sorry, in the applicant pool, they have MCAT scores that on average are more than 1 standard deviation below those of whites, and almost a standard deviation below on their science undergraduate grades. But if you look at the right columns, you see that Blacks make up the same proportion of medical school matriculants as they do of applicants. In fact, all the groups do. There's even more sort of careful racial balancing in the medical school process than there is in law schools. These percentages of applicants and matriculants almost exactly line up. So the schools are completely race norming their admissions process. They're essentially pretending that those credential differences don't exist for purposes of admissions. The results of that are pretty devastating in terms of outcomes that we can still measure in medical schools. GPAs are very different across racial lines to the extent that we can get data on that. And passage rates on medical boards are quite different. I've got one chart here that is kind of intriguing as in the way that it sort of illustrates the mismatch process. Again, indirectly, because we don't have direct data yet on how individual medical students do when you measure their degree of mismatch from their class. But what this table shows is that when you control for a performance index, in other words, the undergraduate credentials of students going in, a much lower percentage of minorities are becoming board certified than non-minorities. And the likely explanation of that is that that's simply mismatch operating again. So what's the effect of these processes? Peter talked about how there's kind of a general lowering of standards. What you see in the professional school context is that we've kind of become hostile to the idea of examining what's actually happening. And the story about Professor Sellers at Georgetown is a powerful example. But you can see it anywhere. The LSAC study that I described as happening in the early 1990s could never happen today. People are too afraid of what the data would show. There's just tremendous hostility towards doing any kind of systematic research on actual outcomes that are occurring within law schools. Law schools would not participate in such a study. what I've seen over time is a dramatic decrease in the willingness of higher education institutions to respond to FOIA requests. I had great success getting FOIA data when I started my original affirmative action article, but that success rate has steadily fallen. If I put in a contemporary number, it would probably essentially be 0, because the schools almost, just tell you that they're going to throw the request in the trash these days. Yeah. So the last point here kind of echoes what Peter was saying. There's at my law school, there have been 5 waves of grade reform since I joined the faculty 30 years ago. Each wave has involved basically relaxing the standards of what it takes to get A, and sort of trying to drive C's into extinction. I think B minuses are now the next target for extinction. There's more and more discussion about getting rid of bar exams altogether. My state of California has lowered the threshold you need to pass the California bar exam, and some other states are taking similar measures. Many schools are talking about eliminating the LSAT. There was a move within the American Bar Foundation to eliminate the requirement that that applicants have LSAT scores for law school applications. So there is a pretty wide-ranging assault on these sort of standards within professional education. An important issue for us to think about is that, with the Harvard and UNC cases coming before the Supreme Court and likely to be decided in the next few months, and likely to restrict the scope of legal preferences, we might think that the mismatch problem is sort of going to be cured. But the pattern of behavior at law schools has been to disregard, or largely disregard, state mandates to eliminate preferences. So there are now about 10 states that have prohibited the use of racial preferences in state school admissions. I don't know of any state school that's actually fully complying with those requirements. What you see in this chart is that the level of preferences is usually lower at schools that are under these bans, but still pretty substantial. And the degree to which they're disregarded correlates somewhat with the degree of willingness of the school. So University of Michigan is a particularly flagrant disregarder of the requirements. So what can we do? I think there are a few constructive steps that can be taken. One is that we have to get across the idea that racial diversity in the professions requires moving away from racial diversity at schools and individual schools as a sort of an equivalence. We need to find ways to make schools more accountable for their admissions policies, and recognize that if they're achieving proportional representation, there's probably something illegitimate that they're doing in that process. We need to push these schools for greater transparency. And again, just thinking about the whole process rather than the individual school process. We can use SES-based outreach and moderate SES preferences to offset a lot of the effect of the ban on racial preferences. University of California, during its early years, when it took Prop 209 in California seriously, was quite successful in using expanded outreach to generate many, many more applications from low-income students, including disproportionately Black and Hispanic students. And that meant that they were able to admit many more students without preferences than they had before. So for the first decade or so after Prop 209 was implemented, you saw a very tangible decline in mismatch effects at the University of California. Something that I would like to see, that I've proposed and actually got my faculty to adopt, although not to implement, is to do offer the following course to juniors at community colleges like Los Angeles City College. You essentially take a first-year course from the law school curriculum and offer it to as many students at this community college who want to take it, with the caveats that, number one, you're going to grade the course just as you would grade a group of law school students. You're not going to grade on a curve. And number two, then anyone who gets an A in the course will be guaranteed a place at UCLA Law School. So I predict that a course like that would generate a really large enrollments, that a lot of students would work very hard, they would learn a lot, and a significant number of students who might perform badly on the LSAT would perform very well in the course. So you would succeed in identifying, you not only stimulate interests from underrepresented groups in legal education, but you would identify students for whom their LSAT scores were under predicting their actual academic potential. So doing creative things like that are ways of advancing diversity without getting students into a mismatch box. Then, of course, we want to emphasize that diversity is multidimensional, that it's not primarily about race. It's really about diversity of experience, diversity of ideas, and rededicate ourselves to trying to foster the true academic mission of universities. So why don't I stop there? Thanks very much.
And thank you so much. Lovely. And we will now go to Robert for the third one of our presentations.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. I will say that it's a bit intimidating to be told that you'll be talking about affirmative action and you're going to be going after Richard Sander and Peter Arcidiacono. But to avoid repeating too much of what's already been said, I really wanted to focus on the future of affirmative action and the future of how affirmative action will interact with academic standards. Now, as we've already talked about a bit, affirmative action can reduce academic standards in a few ways. By definition, affirmative action is the reduction of academic standards in admission because you're substituting race for the academic standards that the university would usually use. And then, of course, if you use standards, if you use preferences that are overly aggressive, you wind up admitting students who are not on par with their peers, and you have to reduce standards at the university as well. So faced with that, you might think that a Supreme Court ruling eliminating the use of race in admissions would send things going in the opposite direction. But I'm going to argue that actually ending affirmative action, the way things are headed, could actually end up reducing academic standards even more because of the way that colleges are likely to respond to this. There are a few angles we can use to look at this. One is the history of affirmative action bans in the U.S. This isn't our first rodeo. There have been numerous states, as Professor Sander discussed, that have already done this. And there was a really interesting study about 10 years ago by Richard Collenberg and Haley Potter at the Century Foundation, where they went through the data on demographic shifts in the places that had banned affirmative action. And what they essentially found is that right when an affirmative action ban goes into effect, at the state's most selective universities, the flagship universities, there's an abrupt shift in demographics, typically with Black students becoming less likely to be admitted, but that this slowly rebounds over time. And at many of these schools, it actually fully rebounds. So the question one has to ask is, why is that happening? I think part of it, as Professor Sander alluded to, is that there's to some extent the universities are just defying these rules. I think if people within a university admissions department tend to continue giving tips to Black and Hispanic students, their superiors are probably not overly likely to come down on them very, very hard. Which isn't to say there's a massive conspiracy to completely ignore it, but I do think that it continues to some extent. But to a large extent, in what Collenberg and Potter went through in their report, this happens because of intentional efforts, legal efforts, and open efforts to restore the previous academic balance using what they call race-neutral alternatives. And though these are implemented in a race-neutral fashion, they do not explicitly consider race. The explicit goal of them is to restore the previous racial balance, and they're judged as a success or not based on whether they do. And as an observer of the affirmative action debate, one of the things I found pretty striking is that affirmative action opponents are generally pretty much okay with this. I don't know how many of you saw the oral argument at the Supreme Court, but this was a big focus of a lot of the discussion. The plaintiffs' lawyers themselves said they were fine with, for example, using college essays if students write about their race, write about their experiences with discrimination, and schools let them in on that basis. They said they were fine with it. And affirmative action opponents have even risen to the challenge of trying to help achieve the same level of diversity without affirmative action. One of the funnier moments in the oral argument of the Supreme Court was a discussion of simulation D, which one of the justices mispronounced as stimulation D. This was a proposal from the folks challenging affirmative action to use other measures to achieve the same level of racial balance. So I think race neutral alternatives raise some really interesting questions. The argument for them, I think, is very good. The argument for them is that you can focus on actual disadvantage. You can use class-based preferences. You can admit the top 10% of each, students in each high school class, so that you're admitting more students from poorly performing and segregated schools. These are good arguments. But if our concern is academic standards, there was an interesting paper by Glenn Lowry and Roland Fryer a while back that demonstrated this mathematically, but I think it also makes a lot of sense. And the idea is that if your actual goal is to have a specific racial balance, a specific racial mix, the most efficient way to do that is to simply have a quota. So for example, if you've decided that 15% of your student population needs to be Black, the way to do that with the least reduction in academic standards is to just assign 15% of the slots to Black students, admit the most qualified Black students you can, and then admit the rest of the class purely on merit. And obviously, when you instead use a proxy for race, you end up giving preferences to people who fall outside your target group. And that was also an issue with simulation D. Harvard's response to that is that if they implemented that to restore pretty close to their original racial balance, they would have to basically really undermine their entire admissions process to do that. Another interesting question, I think, with race neutral alternatives is has to do with the legal and the and sort of the moral aspect of it. Why is it okay to deliberately racially engineer your student body if it's not okay to simply do it based on race? We certainly don't allow employers to do that. If an employer, falls under some sort of ban that they're not allowed to discriminate based on race, and they deliberately turn to other measures to discriminate based on race, we call that that's illegal. And in fact, it's even illegal if they do it unintentionally under the doctrine of disparate impact. And at oral argument, Justice Sotomayor actually called them out on this. You're saying you say this is a race neutral alternative, but you've devised this simulation specifically to address racial concerns, and you did it to restore the racial balance. So what's the difference? It's not really race neutral. Well, I thought that was an interesting point. So to bring all of that together with our current experience and what we saw at oral argument, I think the mixed results of the previous affirmative action bans suggest that, first of all, they did matter. They forced colleges to change what they were doing. In some cases, they enduringly changed the level of preference they were giving to different groups and changed the demographic makeup of the schools. And a lot of these schools, they're willing to make a ton of effort to get back to where they were. But if they couldn't quite get back to where they weren't willing to really take extreme measures, things like stopping the use of standardized tests and so on. So to me, the question with the current, with the forthcoming Supreme Court ruling is this time going to be different? A lot of these affirmative action bans are passed decades ago, and now we're in a very different time period. There's been a long movement to ditch standardized testing. The Supreme Court ruling is going to provide a new incentive to ditch standardized testing. And also we have had the pandemic. And I think the pandemic had a similar effect on standardized testing that it had on working from home. Basically what it did was it forced everybody to give it a shot. And some people will decide they like it. Some people might hate it and never go back. But it forced everybody to give it a shot. It made something thinkable in a way that it wasn't before. And I have a project in the works where I'm digging into some of this stuff, and I wanted to share some of my preliminary results. But first of all, there's a group called Fair Test that keeps track of standardized testing at the nation's colleges. They currently say about 1,800 schools are test optional, and about 80 or so are completely test blind, meaning even if students submit their test scores, they don't consider them. But there's also a federal database called IPEDS, where they survey schools every single year. They get all sorts of data from these schools, including their admissions standards, their demographic makeup, their test scores, and so on and so forth. And I have some data from there I wanted to share if I can get screen sharing to work here. There we go. But essentially what I did is I pulled the data on schools reporting to IPEDS. It's not working. Not sure what's going on here. I apologize. But at any rate, in the IPEDS data, it's very clear that between 2019 and 2021, you saw just an incredibly massive drop off in the number of schools requiring standardized tests. In 2019 year, you had essentially a majority of schools that grant BAs and are not open admissions were requiring standardized tests. As of 2021, very, very few schools were requiring them. And this is something where their hands were forced by the pandemic, because in that in that year, gosh, some of the testing sessions were actually even canceled. So the question, the two big questions here are: what effect does this have on the demographic makeup? Is this something that schools can actually use successfully to boost their demographics? And another is it going to stick? So my preliminary results on the demographic effect is that there is essentially an effect in the expected direction. You do see a bit of increased Black enrollment, to a less extent Hispanic enrollment, and these changes correspond to the test scores that had previously been required at those schools. And the second question of whether it's going to stick is going to be the question for the long term. Because here we go. There we go. Okay, here we go. So here's the data on testing requirements at schools that require BAs. Oh my God. Okay, so here's the IPEDS data on schools that offer BAs. You can see the required field very dramatically shrinks between 2019 and 2021. The question of whether it's going to stick is going to be determined by basically how well they like that. And also the SCOTUS ruling is going to give them a big incentive to continue it. But at the same time, this is something where their hands were forced. They were not able to get test scores from a lot of kids. So a lot of them were just sort of sympathetic to the demands of the pandemic. So these data don't necessarily show us the future of standardized testing. So but I do think we can get a little bit of a glimpse of the future by looking specifically at the University of California system, which combines, I think, three important features. One feature is that they've already banned affirmative action, so we can see how things change in an environment where it's banned. Another aspect of it is that they've jumped into the war on testing with both feet. They have completely gotten rid of testing and plan to keep that permanently. And the third thing is that they provide their own data in really easily accessible format and it goes through 2022, so we can see an extra year of data. So here you can see the 9 schools of the University of California system, and you can see the share of students who are Black in each of these categories: applicants, admits, and enrollees. And to me, you can see some striking patterns at a few of the different schools, but to me, the most striking one is UCLA. As Professor Sander mentioned, there's for about 10 years, there's really an effect of the affirmative action ban that went into effect. Following that, there's a gradual rebound. And if you look in the few years that they've had no testing, they seem to be admitting Black students roughly in the same pattern that they were before affirmative action was even banned. And here's a second slide where you can see the same thing for Hispanics, which is much less dramatic, but still has, I think, some interesting patterns in it. So sorry about the technical difficulties there. I'm going to unshare my screen. But yeah, to wrap up what I was saying, I think that if we're concerned about the decline of academic standards owing to affirmative action, I think there's very good reason to be concerned about that. But I'm not sure that that the fight is over once affirmative action is gone. I think there's going to be a lot of reaction by universities, and I think some of it may be actually counterproductive in that regard. Thank you.
And thank you so much. Thank you all. Now, I'm going to go straight to questions. I will actually go back to the very first one we received, even I think before the questions, from Dave Porter. A review of the grades by academic departments, by academic department at Berea College in 2015 revealed that while the programs most highly rated by students on academic quality, which were basic and social sciences, provided 20 to 25% A grades, many programs rated lower provided far fewer graduate school opportunities, education, English, and theater, but awarded well over 50% A grades to students in these majors. And many minority students not wanting to play GPA roulette, which, by the way, is a brilliant phrase I want to publicize, have been enticed into dead-end academic programs. The administration and faculty refused to intervene, citing concerns about academic freedom. Comments on this? To any and all.
Peter's the expert on this.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know those exact results from Berea, though I'm familiar with a lot of the studies out of Berea. I think they've got really great work. I think that's something you definitely see. My son went to Stanford as a computer science major. There, they have classes where the room holds 200, but well over 200 people sign up for the class. There aren't enough seats for the class in the computer science class because there's so much demand. And then you go to the humanities class and it's 15 and you're required to be there. And I think what's happened is a shift of a college degree used to just be a college degree. And majors matter way more now than I think they did in the past. And you're really seeing that with computer science in particular. And just to piggyback on stuff that both Robert and Rick said, the fact that we refuse to use our data to help identify those students that are going to struggle is such a shame. The idea that UC Berkeley would not even collect data on their test scores, even if you didn't use them in admissions, just use them for placement in the math classes and identify those who are going to struggle, that's a tragedy. How can universities be so anti-science? And so I think we're going to be at a crossroads of, some universities are going to go the UC Berkeley route. My hope is that other universities will go the other way and want to use their data to help their students. I think you see that with why MIT decided to keep the standardized tests. They took them off, they put them for the pandemic, and they put them back in. And they put them back in because they actually looked at the data and found that those test scores mattered for the performance of their kids. Why would we not do that? It seems insane.
Thank you. And does anybody else want to speak to this? All right, going once, going twice. I will shift to a question in the chat thing as opposed to the Q&A. Maya Nowakowski asks, any ideas about making schools responsible for outcomes, graduation rates, passing bar and board exams, jobs? To any and all.
That would be a great idea if we could do it. There have been a couple of suits against law schools from many people who were, expected to not do well, but they didn't get anywhere because they couldn't find evidence of an explicit or implied contract between the schools and the people that were being admitted. But you can imagine some state legislatures, passing rules like that, at least for public universities. And if they did that and those stuck and actually led to improved outcomes, that could be a powerful example for other institutions.
But there's been this movement away from making that data public. I mean, all the movement away from the U.S. News and World Report rankings of these schools is really a way of hiding data. All the data that goes into those rating systems is stuff that everybody should have had access to anyway, that the students, schools should be providing that information. And some school, I think, is going to, this is again my hope, is that you will get schools that actually respond to the appropriate way to make that stuff clear. But right now, it seems like the schools hold the bargaining power in something like this.
I would just add that I think a promising way of implementing something like this would be through the student loan system. We have all these complaints about kids drowning in debt, not being able to pay off their loans. If a school is getting loan money to fund its operations and it's not preparing its students well, I think that would be a good way to go after the schools. But that would involve reforming the student loan system in the opposite way that we've been up to lately.
Thank you. I'm going to go to a question from Paul Lake. Vivek Ramaswamy, a 2024 presidential contender, stated that if he wins the election, he will cancel affirmative action on his first day in office. To what extent would that, or could that executive order work its way into public university admissions policy, if at all?
Well, not much. I mean, the President of the United States has very little control over education, either public or private, because we don't have any national universities. What a president could do is, at considerable political cost, is try to reform the accreditation system. Currently a lot of the accreditation processes operate through the Department of Education, and that ties into things like the student loan system that Robert mentioned. And the accreditors for the past couple of decades have been a strong, essentially special interest pushing schools to do something like proportional racial representation. There was a famous incident involving George Mason's law school, now the Scalia Law School, that tried to move away from preferences and was told by the law school accreditation folks that if you don't get your minority numbers up, then we're going to remove your accreditation.
Thank you. Anyone else on that? All right, going once and going twice. Let me see. From Erin M. Thank you, fascinating. For the second presentation, in looking at LSAT scores and passing the bar, it seemed Arkansas managed to get significant percentages of students with low LSAT scores to pass the bar the first time. Did I understand the slide data correctly? If so, do law schools with students with lower admissions criteria use different teaching pedagogy to ensure students with lower scores and GPAs close the gap to pass the bar?
It's a good question. We can test that pretty well, and there's no sign that that Arkansas's better results are because they're teaching more to the bar. If anything, UCLA had seemed to have better bar outcomes when you controlled for credentials and other factors that we could control for. So it really is just the absence of mismatch. What the key to Arkansas's spectacular results with students with 150 LSAT scores is that their median student is pretty close to 150 LSAT score. That means that all the classes are being taught towards students at that level of preparation. Those of us who teach in classrooms understand how this works. You're always trying to balance the sort of economy of your presentation with whether you're bringing the class with you, and you're very sensitive to where that median student in your class is in terms of following the complexity of what you're presenting. So teachers modulate what they do based on where they think the class is as a whole. If you've got outliers who are much less academically prepared, they're just not going to learn as much.
Anyone else?
David, do you mind if I jumped in on a different point?
Sure, go for it.
I want to talk a little bit more about what Robert raised on the race neutral alternatives, because I thought that was a very interesting discussion that he had there. There was actually a paper recently by Black, Denning, and Rothstein, and one of the things they were looking at Texas's top 10% law and saying, well, who came in as a result of that law and who was pushed out. And what was interesting is that the people who came in under that law actually did better than the people pushed out, but they also had higher test scores. And this is this weird thing about the way these admissions processes work, is we end up we think about those things like test scores as really favoring the rich. But the issue is that the other things favor the rich even more. So this move to ban tests, in my view, is a horrible, horrible idea, because think about how well you can rig the college essay when you can pay somebody to be your college counselor. Think about the opportunities that people who are rich have in terms of being able to participate in extracurricular activities and such. In Korea, they actually have sort of two tracks for admissions. I'm not an expert on Korea, so this is just sort of my layman's understanding. One is through taking a test, and so all academics. And then they have their holistic branch. And it's recognized that the holistic branch actually favors the rich. The US is sort of, a big outlier by having these holistic admissions processes.
Yeah,
Thank
which is part of the rationale for having at least mild socioeconomic preferences, because there are these ways in which we probably miss important talent by any sort of conventional set of admissions metrics. There's not a significant underperformance of low SES students, but there are a significant number of low SES students who can do very well. And I think that may be part of why at University of California we saw improvements in performance when there was a shift from strictly race-based to more socioeconomic preference systems.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question and encourage more questions from other folks as well. But how much is the public aware of mismatch? I mean, I'm given to understand that in effect, the public just doesn't know how severe the mismatch is. Do you have thoughts on this and how public knowledge can be increased if in point of fact it is a problem?
I think the public's very unaware. I think that when you ask these polls about whether you favor using race in admissions, I'm not sure you'd even really be able to know what that means, because there's sort of a really large space between race as a tiebreaker and the proportional representation that somebody like Ibram Kendi would favor. And the reason they're not aware is because universities hide their data. So we don't know. That was actually why I took the Harvard and UNC cases, was because I got to actually see how big those preferences were. How can I study affirmative action? I don't even know how big the preferences are, except through data that is good. But with those cases, you actually get to really peek behind the veil and see, yeah, we're talking about 3/4 of Black admits who are there because of affirmative action. That's a very large share. What the optimal amount is, maybe there is a little bit of a role for affirmative action depending upon what your views are and such, but it might not be, what universities are actually doing, maybe too much or too little depending upon where you stand. The reality is mismatch, if you just did a little bit of affirmative action, I don't think there's scope for mismatch. It is good to go to a school that's a little bit better than you. But when you get into like one standard deviation worse in terms of your backgrounds, and you want to do major in the sciences, that's going to be a problem. And then you can really expect to be hit by it.
Anyone else want to speak to this? What? Okay, I'm going to ask for another question then on a slightly different thing. Is this actually somewhat of a diversion from what really matters, namely policemen, firemen, and licensure of all sorts? Are we focusing excessively on academics when we should be focusing on, for heaven's sakes, it matters more that you've got a cop who knows what he's doing than, I hate to say this, than a lawyer who knows what he's doing? To any and all.
Well, I feel like I'm talking too much, but I'm happy to weigh in on that, which is I'm very sympathetic to that question. We spend so much time on the racial stuff, focusing in on affirmative action, which is relevant for this sliver of super selective schools at the undergraduate level. Now, that's not true at the professional school level. There, it's sort of relevant for sort of all schools. But to me, a lot of the discussion on affirmative action is a distraction from dealing with more serious issues, in particular those test score gaps going in, and the lack of trust in institutions that we're seeing in some segments.
Since this hasn't come up otherwise, let me just mention that there's a growing amount of evidence, and I'm doing some research on this right now, about how lower levels of racial segregation in housing markets narrow performance gaps. So it seems clear that at least 30% of the black-white test score gap can be addressed by, moderately increasing levels of housing segregation. that translates into community interaction, and translates into what happens at schools. So there are ways that we can get at sort of the fundamental disparities. And if we do that, that would have consequences, across society, not just for elite higher education.
I am going to go back to a question from the audience. Emily Hebner asks, can you please address the students registered at disability offices, the problem of late papers, excused absences, reduced reading skills, which I think is in effect saying, is this a disguised version of preference, mismatch, etc.? To any and all.
Robert, you've been very quiet. Do you want to take that one?
Well, I think I'm the only panelist who is not actually a college professor, so I have no idea about this problem.
Well, it is a problem. We have more and more skittishness about sort of the concept of evaluation. There's sort of this ideology of non-judgmentalism that seems stronger and stronger in academia. It's which underlies a lot of what we've said. It's as though you need to apologize for giving someone a grade, and this feeds into a lot of the dramatic protections that we have around disability. Now, some of it is great. It shows greater sensitivity towards individual needs, but there is here, as in a lot of other EDI related issues, kind of overperformance, overindulgence of the ideology.
And I'm waiting for the paper that shows the relationship between that and parental income. My strong suspicion is that the extended time in sex is actually very positively correlated with parental income. That doesn't mean that the issues aren't there, but it's not equitable the way that it's practiced, maybe just on the diagnosis side or whatever. But I'm quite sympathetic to the fact that this happens a lot, where it seems like each year the number of students who want extended time and such, it's going up.
And since you're being polite, I'm just going to say the self-interested hypochondria of the rich. Thank you. We've now said it in a less polite way. Anyone else on this subject?
Well, this is why I want Robert to be talking, so that he can say the stuff that keeps so Rick and I don't get in trouble.
That's right.
Well, I will also then go to a question from Tony Anadio. Is there any data on the reverse of this problem? Students who do not get into colleges, universities that are at or just above their academic level and have to go to lesser schools.
What's called a reverse mismatch.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that also plays out overwhelmingly through an SES lens. In other words, low SES students are much more likely than their scores would predict to go to community colleges rather than elite colleges. There is an underpresence of low SES students, especially low SES whites and Asians. I think overmatch can potentially be as harmful as undermatch. It doesn't show up in something like analyzing bar passage, because we don't have bar scores. We just have whether you pass or fail. So we can't tell if really super students who go to mediocre schools are passing too easily, or are not learning as much as they would at another school. But it's an important question.
Anyone else?
I just wanted to say I agree with that. There is some data. I was kind of furiously Googling for the paper I'd read about it, but I can't find it. But yeah, there's a substantial number of kids, especially poorer kids, and including a lot of minority students who wind up going to a school that they could do better than, in part because of the information that they don't have.
I'm going to have a question, which, if you've already said this, forgive me. Is there good data correlating mismatch and unrepayable college debts? To any and all.
Well, I haven't seen the data, but you do. It is clear that what's the best way to put it? That a lot of students who never become lawyers have enormous debts and are unambiguously much worse off for having entered the JD enterprise at all.
Yeah, a lot of the at the undergraduate level, a lot of the student debt problem is at lower quality schools where somebody went for a few years and ended up dropping out. I don't know that you would necessarily really call that mismatch necessarily. In fact, at the undergraduate level, a lot of the better colleges actually have much higher graduation rates, including for minority students. So I think the connection there is a little bit limited, but yeah, to the extent that the mismatch is a problem that's causing dropouts, causing bar failure, yeah, those are going to result in some student debt problems.
Thank you. And well, going once, going twice, and a question from Jacob Mackey. Could the panelists speak more about what happened in California after 1996? I have heard that Black and Hispanic college matriculation declined precipitously. Is this true? Is there a good source to read on this? I'm going to say, by the way, there is stuff at the NAS website, and I'm going to actually try to put it into the links as soon as I can, but other people can speak about other stuff. Anyone and anyone.
Yeah, I published an article in the University of Chicago Law Review online that talks about this some. And it is a subject that the media, with great devotion, misrepresents. So there is a lot of bad information out there. The truth is that Black and Hispanic enrollment at the UC schools dipped. Black enrollment dipped significantly in the year after Prop 209 went into effect, and took about 4 years to recover to its pre-Prop 209 level. Hispanic enrollment dipped slightly and took off more quickly. 10 years after Prop 209, Black and Hispanic enrollments were definitely higher than they were before Prop 209. And you had dramatic increases in applications as well. A lot of the confusion on this comes from which school you're looking at. So if you only look at UCLA and Berkeley, you see steeper declines, especially in Black enrollment. But those were offset by increases in enrollment at the other UC schools. It could only be the case that Black enrollment wouldn't decline at Berkeley and UCLA if they simply disregard the law. But as we've seen, they did have good faith implementation for the first 10 years or so. So what you saw was a reallocation of students across campuses. And that Peter has shown pretty convincingly that led to higher performance outcomes, both improved graduation, improved share of students in STEM fields, and so on.
If it would be okay, I can share my screen again, because I actually had some of those data on one of my charts during my completely botched attempt to show images. But I'm going to try it again. Let's try that. The screen share button. Here it is. Okay. So here we go. That was a mistake. Oh my God.
I'll just make one quick comment, which is that affirmative action is really about affecting where people go to college, not whether they go to college. And that's because affirmative actions operate at these selective schools. We focus so much on that UC system, but the Cal State system is a lot bigger, and yet, so it's not like you either go UC Berkeley or I'm not going to go to college. You're typically going to be going to college someplace.
Okay, and here I'm going to just leave this in this form, because every time I try to play the slideshow, it fails on me. But here you can see all 9 of these schools and their Black share of enrollees, applicants, and admits, and I had the same chart for Hispanics here. So as Professor Sander noted, especially at the most selective schools, there was a big drop off right after the law goes into effect, followed by, at least in UCLA's case, a gradual rebound. And then, of course, you can see in the last few years since they've gone test blind, there's been more change yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when you take all these things into account, then what you see is, for example, the number of Blacks receiving STEM degrees from a UC campus more than doubled in the 10 years after Prop 209 went into effect.
Let me All right, let's see. Anybody else on this? Or if not, I will go to Daniel Bonovic. Wouldn't preference based on SES, social economic status, just replicate the mismatch problem in a slightly different form? As someone who grew up in a lower SES, I think standardized tests are all you need to promote equality. To any and all.
I can weigh in on that because I made that part of my presentation a little bit. But
Yeah.
basically, I think the answer is yeah. I mean, it depends how severe it is. As Professor Arcidiacono mentioned, a little bit of affirmative action is probably good for everybody. If you just barely miss getting into Harvard and you're granted admission instead, that's going to be really good for you. But if you use these preferences strongly enough to replicate your previous racial balance, which it appears that a lot of schools have done in states that have banned affirmative action, and also I think they're more poised to do now because of the thinkability of banning standardized tests. Yeah, I think that's going to replicate a lot of mismatch problems.
That's right. So if you have a school that is 10% Black now, and they say, well, if we're banned from using race, then we're going to use SES preferences large enough to get 10% Black, you will make the mismatch problem worse because you'll, as Robert says, they're less efficient in achieving a racial goal, so you'll have to use larger preferences. But if you just use SES preferences to achieve SES diversity, and you welcome whatever racial diversity results from that, you can get a lot of SES diversity with pretty small preferences. We did this at my law school after Prop 209, and we had the most economically and socially diverse class that any law school, any elite law school in the United States had ever had. Like half of our students came from the bottom half of the economic distribution, which was unprecedented. Usually it's like 10% come from the bottom half. And the preferences that we used were about a quarter the size of the racial preferences we were using before. So we benefited from the fact that nobody was competing with us for the low SES students. But I think you can get a lot of mileage out of very modest SES preferences. The key is to keep them modest. And to focus on outreach and get all those folks who are now currently overmatched to into the pipeline for your more elite school.
And I would just add that to me, it's to make the preferences transparent, because then at least individuals can make decisions based on good information. And particularly in this more polarized time, my view is that I would rather have flipped the two Michigan Supreme Court cases. That fundamentally, if you're going to have affirmative action, then you would want it to be an explicit point system, so everyone knew exactly how much of a bump they were getting. In a place like Brazil, they take that one step further. They say, you're only going to get a bump for your race if you're going to a public school. That's the other thing we haven't really touched on, is the fact that these racial preferences, you actually get bigger bumps if you're not from a poor family on the basis of race. So it's a very odd system that we currently have, a system, that's behind the veil. So that's the type of stuff you're not going to know.
Excuse me, sorry, I was muted. Question from Mark. What basis are the universities using to deny the FOIA request? And it was actually put in quotes. Is there a basis for rejecting those types? I'm going to say, is there a good and a reasonable basis that could be used? And what are the bases, grounds that are being used in reality, just to divide the two?
Well, a lot of schools will just, just sort of bury things, or they'll send you information in a PDF instead of an Excel file, or there are many devices you can use to sort of make it hard to get the data. But the biggest sort of legal argument that's advanced now is that schools will say we're jeopardizing the privacy of our students. That even if we redact their names and any directly identifiable information, there's so much information on the web now that you can use the limited information we provide to match people up. And there's not much evidence that that's a valid argument, but courts have seemed quite susceptible to it.
Thank you. Anyone else? Going once, going twice. And we go to a question from James Dillon. Is there any connection between the experience of mismatch and the development of a heightened racial consciousness in college students, in students in college?
Well, yeah, I think absolutely. I think that is a key driver of race consciousness in colleges, and it's a good point because we haven't talked about it. But the whole if you have large mismatch that's based on race, then a typical Black student is going to have poor grades, as I showed. And when they talk to other students, they're going to sort of notice there's a pattern. Gee, a lot of my Black friends are also getting low grades. This must be a racist conspiracy. So, it's a kind of a logical process. It's almost engineered to create racial division.
I think that's right on. And that was part of my point with the response to the Sellers affair, is that it was attributed to racism, why they were doing poorly in her class, but there's never any evidence of that. It's just a disparate outcome argument when the credentials are so important to your success. And there's where it's amazing, right? So Georgetown, I'm sure, if they're like every other law school, they've got large racial preferences. And then the response to that is, we're being racist by having creating this racially hostile environment. Well, the reason for that environment is the large racial preferences, not what's actually happening at the law school. And my basis for saying that is that once you account for the difference in credentials, Black students perform just as well as other groups. And so that tells you that it's not like they're in this environment where they can't succeed. They succeed exactly the same way that students of other races succeed, given those credentials.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. I am going to mention sorry, was that somebody or did I just? Okay. I'm going to mention there's been requests, one, to have the books mentioned in our chat. I don't know whether that ever showed up. I hope that will. If not, also there was a request for the slides. I'm going to say that if the people who provided slides today, if you could sort of forward them so that we can have a chance to post them on our linked to the website somehow, that would be lovely. So that can be available for people to see the slides in another case. There's a question from George Seaver, which I'm going to push a little bit. What about the effect of this on the requirements and stability of an extended republic, as in Federalist Paper 10 and 51? But in case people don't want to focus precisely on Federalist Papers 10 and 51, I'm actually going to focus a bit on stability. In effect, how much of our current polarization, destabilizing political polarization, is the consequence of things such as mismatch? That in fact, there's all sorts of reasons that we've been living through tense times, but how much of this do we think is due to the effects of mismatch? Politically, psychologically, on the people and the republic as a whole.
I mean, I would think that relatively little of it is due directly to the specific concept of mismatch and the problems that it engenders. These are certainly problems that college graduates encounter and so on. But I think the broader concept of racial disparity has really bedeviled this country for a long time, and it's really come to a head, 2015, 2020, with law enforcement and so on. I think racial disparities just kind of crop up in every aspect of life, and the way that we try to address them without talking about them or admitting that they exist has been it plays a very large role in our polarization and in the tension that we have today.
But I think universities are doing other things that play into that too, with things like the legacy admissions, or in Harvard's case, the way athletic preferences work in such a way to make it so a key way to get into Harvard is through the sailing team. Those types of things destroy trust in institutions. And I think a lot of the people who would argue for affirmative action say, well, you allow these large preferences over here for legacies and athletes. What's the deal with that? I think that there can be mismatch issues there. I think that they're mitigated in part by the fact that if you come from a family with a lot of money, you're able to compensate in some other ways. But that's also where a little bit of affirmative action is good for you, and too much, maybe if daddy helps you still get the job at the bank, you're not as concerned. But that will be part of the reason that restoring trust in institutions, I think it's actually important to get rid of some of these other preferences. And I think that things like legacy preferences are likely to fall precisely in response to the Supreme Court getting rid of affirmative action.
David, I need to run off to something else that's come up. So accept my apologies, but I've enjoyed the talk very much.
Well, thank you. Look, thank you so much. It's been wonderful having you. So yeah, early thanks to you, and we'll just continue the last few minutes with everyone else. There is a lengthy comment for which I suppose, I'm not sure there's actually a question there, but I'll give the comment just in case people have reactions to it, from Joyce Tarpley. I teach at a community college, so I can speak to this point. We have open enrollment, but we test, at least we used to test, to try to discern how college-ready students might be. Then we used to offer remedial classes to help. But the legislature in our state has lowered test scores and eliminated many of the remedial classes. So we are getting students in our transfer college classes who cannot do college work. The failure rate, especially in online classes, which these students should not take, is very high. The pressure to inflate grades and pass students regardless of their performance is now coming as administration plans to tie success rate for students to the professor's evaluations. I say there's not a question as such, but are there comments on this?
I think that sounds like a great illustration of one of the problems with measurement. Whenever you turn a given measure into your measure of success and base other decisions on it and base funding on it and so forth, that measure then becomes a sort of a pressure point that people try to manipulate. And I think that's a really, really interesting example of it. And I'd be curious how widespread this is in this kind of situation.
Well, that issue of credentialing, I think, is really key. So fundamentally, I think we really want to be moving to something where, the degree actually signals competence in something. And to the extent that that manifests itself through testing and so on, at the end of the day, you're sort of implicitly trusting that when somebody graduates with a degree that they've accumulated some skills. Well, what's the enforcement mechanism if they're not doing that, and they're just handing out diplomas? It takes a long time, for them to figure out that this degree, for the economy to figure out that this degree is worthless. But then once it does, restoring that trust is going to be very difficult.
Thank you. And there was indeed actually a related question. I can't quite get to it now, so I apologize. But in fact, what can the people as consumers do when degrees have been, inflated to a fare thee well? How precisely do we judge and protect ourselves when all of the institution granting stuff has become an unreliable, record of quality?
I mean, I think inevitably you start relying on credentials less if the credentials are no longer doing what they're supposed to do. As Professor Arcidiacono mentioned, that's going to take a long time for people to realize, this specific degree is worthless. These kinds of degrees are useless. But the more that you water down standards and the less that, a degree from a certain college means a specific thing, the less it's going to be reliable. And for those of us who are, critical and cynical about higher education in this country, maybe that's not such a bad result.
Totally agree. And I think that as we get better at figuring out how to do the testing right, then I think that those degrees become less relevant. I think now when some of these job sites, they have tests that you can take to show particular skills. That's the type of thing that you'd really like to have. In my view, more testing is better for exactly that reason, that then you actually see what students have actually learned, or at least what skills they have.
Thank you. And that question was from Linda Sweeney, who I'm glad to credit. We're getting near the end of our webinar, so I'm going to ask, could the two of you each provide a 30 to 60 second conclusion, last thoughts, things that desperately needed to be said, which you hadn't gotten to, and then we'll just get to the wrap up for the webinar. In reverse alphabetical order this time. Robert.
Sure. I mean, this was a great discussion. I think we covered a lot of different angles to the mismatch issue and to the affirmative action issue in general. I just reiterate from kind of the main points that I made before is I'm really fascinated by this question of how things are going to go after the Supreme Court rules. I'm really fascinated by the question of how our academic standards are going to change in the wake of that. I think we have something of a clue from how states, schools and states that banned affirmative action reacted then, but I also think it's different this time. I think it's just much more common to see completely eliminating standardized tests as a live option on the table for dealing with this, and I think it's going to be a time of great upheaval, and I'm really looking forward to looking at all the data and whatnot that comes out in the coming 5 years or so.
May you live in interesting times. It's good to be a social scientist. Peter.
Yeah, I think it'd be even better to be a social scientist if they actually provided their data. And this is where, to me, the biggest thing is the lack of transparency. We just got through with dealing with COVID, and universities handled COVID in very different ways. You look at a place like Notre Dame, they basically said, come, we're going to do you have to do some things, but we're going to have classes in person and such. And in some cases, you're going to have to wear masks early on, but later on, not so much. But then there are these other Ivy League schools that had very different policies. The fact that we don't know the rates of mental illness across those two paths is ridiculous, and it's where I would like to see a university take the lead on being much more upfront with their data. That data could actually be used to make sure that we get good matches between students and occupations. And it would be used to really help the students identify things ahead of time where their skills might not be up to stuff, and then do something about it. Right now, I feel like universities are Luddites, which is, how is that possible? The place that's supposed to be seeking the truth is the one place that actually wants to hide from the information. UC Berkeley hiding from the information about the test scores, it just seems incredibly anti-intellectual. So to me, the best place to push on is pushing for more data transparency, across the board. I would love to see something like that. I mean, we talked about IPED's data. IPED's data has some interesting things, but it's woefully inadequate. There's so much that's not there. You can't really test for mismatch in the IPED's data because the schools have dug in their heels so they don't collect the information. So much more of a push on that transparency so that families can make good decisions with where they go to college. I think one place where you've seen something good with that would be like the college scorecard data, where at least they show here's sort of what earnings the graduates are getting from their school.
Thank you. And thank you both so much. I'm going to get back to the thank yous to everyone. I'm just going to do a little bit of business for the NAS before I get to the final thank yous. So business. If you have leftover questions and it didn't get answered, please send them to randall@nas.org, RANDALL@nas.org. I'll be delighted, excuse me, to forward your questions to our panelists so they can have the option to respond to you. And again, you can watch this at any time within 24 hours on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel. I will also mention, if you like this, I encourage you to join the National Association of Scholars, www.nas.org. I think there's a handy button saying join on virtually every part of our website. So I encourage you to join, support webinars such as this. Webinars such as this is part of a continuing series. We are continuing through, frankly, more or less when the Supreme Court hands down its decision, and we will presumably have follow-up stuff on what happens now. when we find out precisely what that decision has been. We also have other series such as American Invention. In the next week or two, we're doing stuff on, I believe that's the typewriter, and then Benjamin Franklin and the discovery of lightning. Really good stuff. I think you might enjoy that as well. Thank you is the final word. Thank you to our panelists. Wonderful to listen, wonderful to learn. Thank you to the audience. We do it for you. We can't do it without you. I was passing on your questions. Your questions are what make this a good webinar. So very grateful to our audience, above all, even though the faces on the screen are the panelists. But anyway, it's been wonderful, and it's been delightful. Thank you so much, and everybody have a lovely afternoon.